Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Brass 101, a special spring refresher. We're happy to have all of you join us here tonight. Before we get into our program, just a few operational notes for this evening. We will begin shortly with an introduction from Cindy Burlack, and then we'll go to our program with ARI certified instructor Lindsay Mann, who has been a big support for us here at Brass. We will do a Q&A at the end of her presentation. That'll probably be about 45 or 50 minutes into the evening. We'll do an organized Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. We'll try to get everything answered. And then after the Q&A, we'll have a special showing of the 13-minute film Off-Piste, which was produced by Brass. To kick things off tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce an amazing woman who has been a real spirit behind the things that we do at Brass. Please welcome Cindy Burlack.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that generous introduction. I think you're just magical making all this technology work. It's way beyond me. You're in Utah, I'm in New Hampshire, and our presenter is in Idaho. I know everybody younger is just used to all this, but I'm still amazed by it all. We at Brass, the Bryce Ronnie Athlete Snow Safety Foundation, are sensitive to every avalanche fatality, of which there have been many this winter. Our hearts stop whenever we hear about one. We want to wind back time and whisper warnings into the ear of the victim. Each year, we wish we could do the same on January 5th. That's the date Bryce Astle and our son, Ronnie Burlack, passed away in an avalanche in Austria in 2015. Who would have thought it possible for US ski team athletes to die on a race trip? No one. But avalanches are full of surprises. So we're here whispering warnings into your ears. Please talk about what you learn here while you're with your skiing buddies, listen carefully, and continue on your own road to becoming avalanche savvy. If you appreciate what you gain here tonight, please go to our website, brassavalanche.org, and donate, even if it's a very small amount. That will help us to keep spreading the word. Together, we can save lives. The groups who are already supporting us are Utah Avalanche Center, Backcountry Access, BlizzTech, World Cup Supply, Reco, and US Ski and Snowboard. Yesterday was a glorious spring day here in New England, and I skied our hotspot for avalanches, Tuckerman's Ravine. The forecasters were on the job there, and I passed out Brass stickers to many appreciative skiers and riders. If you go there, please read and heed the avalanche report found on Mount Washington Avalanche Center.org. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, Lindsay Mann. She's a certified mountain guide, ARI avalanche instructor, and a U16 coach in the Sun Valley race program. Her expertise intersects with our goal of making snow safety easily available to accomplished skiers and ski racers like you. We're proud to have her as a spokesperson for Brass. Here she is, Lindsay Mann.
Thanks, Cindy, for the introduction. Thank you, Tom, for all the help with technology. A big thank you to the Brass Foundation for inviting me here tonight. And I also want to make sure that we welcome Jamie Astle, who's also joining us tonight. Both the Burlacks and the Astle families, I can't thank enough for helping put this together and inviting me to be a part of it. And of course, thanks to everyone who's able to join tonight. So why are we here tonight? Why are we doing this? Well, when we were talking at Brass, we decided that it would be really nice to do a spring refresher as the competition season is winding down and athletes and parents and coaches are hopefully finding themselves with a little bit more free time to maybe get out and explore in the backcountry. During tonight's presentation, like Tom said already, but we're going to start out by going through a little bit about what's been going on this winter and talking about some of the avalanche accidents, and then getting into a little bit more of the know before you go topics and just giving some reminders and refreshers or maybe some new knowledge about what we can think about going into this spring season. So I like to start out with this statistic, and some of you have maybe seen this before. And if you have, I think that's great because it is super important that 90% of avalanche accidents are triggered by the victim or someone in the victim's group. And really what this means to me is that we can work to prevent the number of avalanche fatalities that are happening out there and hopefully reduce them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some things that I noticed this winter. As I'm sure many of you have read about, it's unfortunately been a very difficult winter in the avalanche community. Last week when I gave this presentation, I was saying that there was 33 avalanche fatalities this winter in the US so far. And unfortunately, in the past few days, there was 2 more avalanche fatalities. So now we're up to 35 fatalities this winter in the US. You can see here in the top part of this slide, it's broken down by their mode of travel. So predominantly skiers, and then about half of the rest of the group is snowmobilers. And then we've got some snowboarders, snowshoers, climbers, hikers. I do want to point out where you can access this information. So if you go to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center and click on accidents and then US, it has this breakdown like I've shown in the slide. And then below that, you can read all the accident reports. And that's a great way to just learn about what's going on out there. Again, we don't want to judge when we're reading them, but it can be a great way to just get you starting to think about some of the ways that we can prevent what's going on out there. So like I said, this winter, we've seen now 35 avalanche fatalities. The average over the past 10 years in the US is 27 avalanche fatalities per winter. So this is a little bit higher so far that we've seen entering the spring season. And behind this data too, it means that there was 27-ish fatal avalanches. Looking through the data, there was just over 60 people caught in these accidents. Then obviously the 35 fatalities. And these accidents have spanned all the way from New Hampshire to Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, to California and Alaska. So they have happened in 9 different states. On the bottom of this slide, one thing that I thought was pretty interesting is the first week of February was a particularly tragic week in terms of avalanche accidents. We had 14 people that were killed in avalanches in a 7-day period. I pulled this photo below of the danger rows from the Utah Avalanche Center for the second week in February. And it stood out to me because there's been very few times in my short time in the mountains that I've ever seen the compass rows go all black. And when that happened, the Utah Avalanche Center was coming out saying, like, please be careful when you're snowshoeing about the terrain around you, when you're hiking, and of course, when you're skiing and riding. And that was just something that I hadn't really seen before, is the compass going all black. So I thought it would be interesting to throw in. A few things that kind of piqued my interest in particular about this winter with these avalanche fatalities is this Mill Creek avalanche in Utah is an example of it. Is there were several accidents where multiple people were buried. Reading that accident report, one thing that really stood out to me is that there was 2 different parties skiing in this area that day. And once the avalanche happened, the people that weren't buried when they started their rescue, the first people that they actually came upon were not people from their group. So they were digging up and uncovering people that had been buried in the avalanche that they didn't even know who they were and that they were out there. And that was something that just really stood out to me. Another avalanche accident that I don't have a picture of that also stood out to me this winter was the square top avalanche in Park City. And I think that's also an interesting one to bring up. It happened at the end of January, just outside the ski area boundaries of Park City Resort. And when the group that was caught, when they got to skiing the slope and talking about it with their group, one person in the group said, "I don't like this. I think that we should stay and ski on the ridge." The other person decided that they did want to ski it. And the person that was standing on the ridge watching their partner watch them get caught in an avalanche. And to me, that's just a good reminder of just being aware of our group dynamics. And if someone in your group is pointing out something that maybe we missed, that we want to make sure that we're listening to them. And that's a really important part of backcountry skiing to me that I've grown to really enjoy, is that it is all about teamwork. It's all about everyone having a voice. Even if you might not be the most experienced person in the group, you can still have very valid observations that are important to share with the group. So why do we think this winter has been so difficult? There was a good article, I think it was, the beginning of March in Climbing magazine, addressing this topic exactly. Why have there been so many avalanche deaths this year? There's several different factors that they talk about in the article, but again, just talking to different avalanche professionals, one of the big things is that across all of the Western US, we got some early snow, and then we didn't get snow for a while. So we had a particularly dry start to the season. And then as we started getting more storms in January and February, that snow was falling on a particularly weak layer. So this weak layer was widespread across the Western US, and that's the quote that I've pulled from the article here. So we had a really poor foundation for our house that we were building our snowpack on. So that's one of the reasons that maybe attributes to why this winter has been so difficult. Another reason that a lot of different people have talked about too is that more people are at least buying backcountry gear. That's something that's easy for people to track. And so with more people buying backcountry gear, it's been harder to get backcountry gear. I know that around here, our avalanche courses have been filling up really quickly this year as well. So there's more people getting out there, and there's more people just using the backcountry. And I think that's another really good reminder for all of us, is that, like that Mill Creek incident points out, is it's also important to just be aware of the groups that we're around and who else might be traveling in the backcountry. Because on some days that can be an incredible asset to have other people out there. On other days, sometimes, depending on where you are in relationship to the other party, that's another hazard that we just want to be aware of, what they're doing and where we are. So what can we do with all of that being said? Is really, for me, a lot of it's just going back to the basics, going back, reviewing these 5 know before you go points, having a plan when we go out, and just really thinking about and going back to the basics of terrain. And that is the biggest piece, and you're going to hear me say this a couple times throughout the presentation, is that terrain is the one piece of the puzzle that we are able to control. And so making sure that our terrain choices match the forecast for the day. Another thing I think that we can do as we go into the spring season and moving forward, is just really reassessing what we consider is safe. And several of these avalanche accidents, as I was reading the reports, it's not just new people that are getting caught in avalanches. It's people that have experience, that in a typical year, the terrain that they were skiing or riding on that particular day has been okay to ski. This year, the conditions were slightly different, and maybe that wasn't a good choice for that day, as we saw in some of these accidents. So we're going to start out with a little video clip here. Sorry about that, technology.
what is an avalanche? There's a lot of different kinds of avalanches, but the kind that causes the most trouble are what we call dry slab avalanches. A slab avalanche is like a monster in a horror film. It lies underneath the perfect facade, this enticing powder. And it's just waiting for a trigger to come along, like you, to collapse that weak layer, and then that collapse just goes outwards in all directions. The slope just shatters like a pane of glass. There's no escape. It rockets down the hill, bounces you off trees and rocks on the way down, tumbles you over a cliff. I mean, does any of that sound dangerous to you?
I was not aware, and I did not comprehend the dangers that were out there that day. When I triggered the avalanche, it wrapped me up immediately. Not a second later, I was hit in the back with what felt like a truck. Didn't even have a chance. I ended up laying there in the snow with 2 broken femurs and my broken left arm for between 7 and 8 hours. I've had a total of 4 surgeries, still in therapy 3 days a week, trying to learn how to walk again and get use of my body again.
Avalanches are very violent events. 1 out of 4 people are killed by the trauma of hitting trees and rocks on the way down. And after they tumble you to the bottom, then the avalanche debris instantly sets up like concrete. You can't just pop up out of this. Somebody else has to get you out of the snow.
Really fun day. It was beautiful powder snow, blue skies, sunshine, just pow shots, nothing extreme. We were trying to get gnarly or anything. Came around the corner, dropped in. It was great, and then saw cracks shoot out all around me. I did see like the sky for a moment, and then just a whole wave of snow went over my face. I had like a moment of, maybe I can just punch through to the top, and as soon as I tried to move at all, I realized that I couldn't even bend a finger.
So like that snowmobiler and the skier pointed out, and they said in the video, avalanches can be very violent. And so going back to how can we prevent getting caught, a lot of it, like I said, goes back to the piece of the puzzle that we have control over, which is terrain. And so not just thinking about the terrain that we're in, but thinking about what terrain is above us, what terrain is connected to the slopes that we are in. Below 30 degrees, we don't tend to see avalanches happen because there's not enough gravity for the snow to slide. 30 to 45 degrees is that prime angle where we see avalanches happen. And then above 45 degrees, we tend to see the snow sloughing off and not really building up the same way to form those slab avalanches. But there's different other factors that we want to consider when we're skiing terrain over 45 degrees, like what's below us, what's around us. And the prime angle that we see for avalanche start zones is right around 38, 39 degrees, like is highlighted in this photo here. And as we're looking at this terrain, and as we're planning not just our down route, but also the way that we're going to travel up slopes, is usually traveling on ridges is a great place. You can get eyes on the terrain that you're about to ski, and then you have a sense of what the terrain's looking like that you are going to ski if you choose to ski it. But again, always considering what's around us, what's above us, what's below us, and where do we want to be stopping with our group. Those are all things that we want to make sure we're communicating and are part of our plan. A couple other terrain features, and some of these have definitely played roles in some of the avalanche accidents this winter, is what we call terrain traps. So terrain traps are any place where the consequences are greater if we were to get caught in an avalanche. So essentially anything like a gully or trees or cliffs or rock bands, just thinking about a place where a small amount of snow could have big consequences. So all of a sudden, if you were to be caught in a small avalanche in a gully, that suddenly could be enough snow to bury you in an avalanche. So just being aware of these are not great places to stop, obviously, or regroup, but just being aware of where they are. So looking out for, like I said, any gullies or creek beds, any sort of sharp transition. Being around trees, just knowing that, again, if you were to get caught in a small slide, you could possibly be pushed into trees. So just being aware of that. And then again, if you're skiing over rocks or cliff bands, and then any sort of really large avalanche path. So that's a fun little video that the Freeride World Tour put out. And before I start talking about this slide here, I do want to just highlight a couple of things that I thought they did a really good job of pointing out in that video. And we'll get into this again in a little bit when we talk about the know before you go points. But having a plan before you go out and making that plan for the terrain that you're going to ski, once you've read the avalanche forecast, once you've read the weather forecast for the day, so that you're making a plan that matches the conditions that are out there. And then especially as we head into the spring skiing, as we all know, corn can be great skiing. And in the backcountry, sometimes that means that we're traveling up when the snow is a little bit firmer. And so again, being aware of just some of those hazards, like I had pointed out before, of, you know, what's below you when you're and above you when you're traveling uphill, especially if you're traveling up on firmer conditions, and making sure that you have the appropriate gear for some of those firmer conditions as we get more into the spring, which is obviously super fun skiing when you hit the timing right. But kind of, we do want to point out too, oh, and I wanted to highlight from the video also that they do a really nice job in that video of also pointing out that Ski Patrol is a great resource, especially if you're thinking of going out of bounds of a ski area and or you're skiing in a new place. So for example, any athletes from the East traveling out West, or anyone traveling overseas to Europe to go skiing, or Canada or South America, Ski Patrol is a great resource to learn more about what the avalanche conditions are and what is and isn't controlled inbounds, which brings us to, you know, inbound skiing versus out of bounds skiing. Is last year in the US, there was 4 inbounds fatalities at resorts. Thankfully, this year to date, we have not had any inbounds fatalities. But I do still think it's important to highlight that there are certain days inbounds where we just want to think a little bit more with our backcountry brains. Ski Patrol does the best that they can to mitigate and control ski terrain inbounds. However, sometimes not everything is perfect, like we've seen with a couple accidents in previous years. Inbounds in the US or in North America, everything's controlled to the best of their ability by Ski Patrol. Once you exit the gates, it's no longer controlled. And we've seen several accidents this year that happened just outside of the ski area boundaries. Usually at those ski area boundaries, a lot of times there is an avalanche forecast posted. It's also a really good reminder to just check in with your group, make sure that everyone has the right gear and that you're all on board with the plan for the day. When we travel outside of the US, it is a little bit different. So especially in Europe, on-piste means that there's been avalanche mitigation work done. Off-piste, they don't control. And that's unfortunately was a misunderstanding that Bryce and Ronnie had when they were caught there. And when we show the full length off-piste video, that's something that they'll go into a little bit more detail about. And again, a great resource to just finding out what is controlled as you travel to a ski area that you're not familiar with is Ski Patrol is really a great resource. So now we're gonna get into reviewing some of the get the points. So get the gear, get the training, get the forecast, get the picture, and get out of harm's way. And I'm gonna start out with a video again, a short video clip from the Utah Avalanche Center.
Avalanche safety can seem totally overwhelming, but there is a systematic step-by-step process that can keep you alive in avalanche terrain. Just knowing 5 basic things can prevent most avalanche accidents. Get the gear, get the training, get the forecast, get the picture, and get out of harm's way.
Everyone who goes into backcountry avalanche terrain needs basic avalanche rescue gear.
You need an avalanche transceiver, a shovel, and a probe. And you need to practice a lot to know how to use all of this gear, because your friend only has about 15 minutes to live buried beneath the snow.
A lot of people also use an inflatable avalanche airbag backpack that will help them rise to the top of avalanche debris. How well does this avalanche rescue gear actually work? Well, for 1 out of 4 people killed in an avalanche, they're gonna die from trauma. They're gonna hit trees or rocks on the way down the slope. So avalanche rescue gear isn't gonna do anything for them. The rest of them die from asphyxia, from breathing their own carbon dioxide underneath the snow. But it doesn't have to be that way.
If everyone wore an avalanche airbag backpack, as well as an avalanche transceiver, 2 out of 3 people who die from asphyxia would still be alive.
The bottom line is avalanche rescue gear will only save about half of us. But in order to stack the odds in my favor, I make sure to never go skiing without them.
As sledders, we travel in the backcountry a little bit differently than skiers, but I still need to have my avalanche gear attached to my body. Having it attached to my tunnel does me no good. If I get separated from my sled, I get separated from my safety gear. If your buddies that you ride with don't have the training and the equipment, don't let them ride with you.
So the first get the point is get the gear. And so having a good avalanche transceiver, and the way that we want to wear those is either in the harness that they come with and or a specific pocket for an avalanche transceiver. Some backcountry pants will come with that feature, and then making sure that that transceiver is still attached to your pants well. But the best place to wear it is in the harness. A couple of things that we want to be checking every time we go out is making sure that we have good battery percentage. So most manufacturers recommend above 50%. Where avalanche transceivers use more battery is when they're in search mode. And so that's really what we're preserving it for. And also we want to be using name brand batteries for this. This isn't really the time to use those Costco batteries or anything off brand. I really recommend for this piece of gear is using a name brand battery, is splurging a little bit since this is a piece of important rescue gear. Another thing we want to check every time we go out with our group, besides battery percentage, is that all of our transceivers are able to work in search mode so that we're picking up our partner's signals, and also that our avalanche transceiver is transmitting a signal. One downside of like those gates or beacon checkers that you'll see when you go out of bounds is they're only checking that your avalanche transceiver is turned on and sending out a signal. So I definitely recommend, even if you're just going out of bounds with your group, treat it like that's the trailhead at the backcountry and check to make sure that everyone's avalanche transceiver has good battery percentage. You're able to pick up everyone's signal and everyone's transmitting out a signal. And we also want to be aware of proximity of electronics to our avalanche transceivers. So the rule of thumb is that when you're in send or transmit mode, you want your cell phones, radios, any sort of electronics at least 20 centimeters away. And when you're in search mode, you want them 50 centimeters away. So when I'm at a trailhead with my backcountry partners, each time before we leave the trailhead, I'll just have them touch where their transceiver is, touch where their radio or cell phone is, so I know that we have that appropriate distance. And then obviously an avalanche probe is what comes with that also. Making sure that your partners know how to use it and put it together, and that it's long enough. What we recommend is having a probe that's at least 260 centimeters long. And then of course, having a shovel. And again, the shoveling is the most time consuming part if you were to have to do an avalanche rescue. So you want a good metal shovel. Having an extendable handle is really nice. And a great way to make sure that you have a good shovel is the most similar thing we have in the front country to avalanche debris is all that plow debris that gets plowed in parking lots. And that's a great place to go out and practice shoveling. And then obviously we want to make sure that we know how to use our gear and that our partners do. If you haven't practiced companion rescue in a while, or maybe you practiced earlier in December, you got busy, you haven't been able to go out and tour as much as you would like, now's a great time to refresh those skills and just go out and practice, go to a beacon park, whatever works, with your people that you're gonna be going out touring with. A couple other pieces of gear that I think are important is obviously having a plan. And I really like to write down my plan for the day so that when I'm in the backcountry, when we get to some of those decision points, I can reference back to it and say, yep, this is what we decided on for the day. Cool, we still feel good about that. Or no, maybe we need to ease off a little bit because we saw some things that made us a little bit more weary of our plan for the day. Other things too to think about carrying, depending how far out you're going, is some sort of satellite device like an inReach, or in the least, letting someone who's not in your group know where you're going, at least what trailhead you're going to and what time they should expect you back, so that if something does happen or whatever, is they at least know where to start looking or where to go out for you. But having a satellite device is great. And then just knowing too, as part of your planning process, am I going to have cell phone service out where I'm touring for the day? And then I know around this time last spring, there was a lot of signs that were up as you were heading out backcountry skiing saying, have the skills to self-rescue. I think that's something that sometimes gets missed. And this picture here, this is a picture of a group that I was with at guides training earlier this season, when we were practicing self-rescue and putting together our rescue sleds. And I can tell you for sure, it takes a lot of work to haul someone out of the backcountry. But again, there's a lot more courses that have come up now that talk more about self-rescue for your group. And as you start maybe getting into backcountry skiing more, is again, thinking about, how would I be able to get someone out of here? Thinking about too, beyond just a rescue sled, but having some sort of first aid kit and repair kit. And like I said, there's a lot more courses too that that are focusing more on rescue now. And a great resource to find some of those courses is ARI.org, avalanche.org, or Know Before You Go has some great resources and gets a little bit more in depth onto some of these points. So again, that can be a great refresher for you, or suggesting that to some of your partners that you're going out with. Also, your local avalanche center is an excellent resource to figure out what events they're hosting. Often they do a lot of education for the community as well. So those are things, getting the gear and getting the training, things that we want to continually be doing as we're preparing throughout the season, and then doing some refreshers like you are tonight and re-practicing with the gear before you are going out. And then once we go out into the backcountry, we want to make sure that we're getting the forecast, getting the picture, and getting out of harm's way. Those are things that we're going to do every time we go out. So as far as getting the forecast, where you can find that is in the US, you can go to avalanche.org, and they have a map up with all of the avalanche forecasting centers on there. So then you can click the forecasting center in your zone that you need. If you're in Canada, you can go to avalanche.ca, and that's a great resource for Canada. A few things to consider with the danger scale is, when I gave this presentation earlier this year, and it's definitely important to highlight still, is most avalanche accidents happen when we're in considerable avalanche danger, or level 3. And the definition of that, or the likelihood, is that natural avalanches are possible, human triggered avalanches are likely. And it says in the travel advice that careful snowpack evaluation, cautious route finding, and conservative decision making is essential. So with each of these colors, I really urge you and recommend that you're also familiar with the travel advice that comes along with each of these colors, the likelihood of avalanches, and the size and distribution of the avalanche. As we get into spring, we tend to see, hopefully, the colors going down to more the yellow and green, which is always nice to see. But still being aware that even in green, under avalanche size and distribution, we can still have small avalanches in isolated areas or extreme terrain. So those are just, again, being aware of some of those terrain traps that I pointed out earlier. And we still don't fully want to let our guard down. We still want to be aware of certain terrain features. And that's the same when we're in moderate. It says, excuse me, under here, small avalanches in specific areas or large avalanches in isolated areas. And human triggered avalanches are still possible when you're in moderate. And so again, just reading beyond or looking beyond the colors with these avalanche forecasts. What an avalanche forecast is going to tell us is what is the problem that day, where has the problem been observed, and where do they expect to see it, and how the weather might affect our plan. So it's important when you're reading the forecast, and if you aren't familiar with, as an example, what a persistent slab is, most avalanche forecasts now, if you scroll over and you can see this little blue eye with the blue circle around it, if I was actually on the website, if I scrolled over that, I could actually click on that and it would tell me what a persistent slab is. Same with all of these below. So they're really trying to make it much more user-friendly, that you don't have to memorize all the terms and you can get the information. And then also looking at the weather forecast that they put out each day. The avalanche forecast centers do a really good job of forecasting specifically for mountain environments and not just like a city or town weather forecast. A lot of forecasts now too, and I pulled this from last Wednesday. It will give you a bottom line at the top of the avalanche forecast. And it's really important, I think, to read this bottom line as well. The forecasters are basically pooling their thesis statements that they want you to read in this section here. And a lot of times they will give you information on what terrain you should either avoid for that day or what terrain is okay to ski in that day. And also as we get into more spring conditions, it's also going to help give you an idea of some of the timing. And then when we're going out each day after we've gotten the picture, we've made our plan for the day, we've selected our terrain, we're going to keep reassessing as we're out there. And that's what we refer to as getting the picture. Is so looking around, just because we see other tracks on the slope doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. So keeping that in mind, we might be there a different time of day. They might be tracks from another day. But just looking around, seeing what's happening while you're out there. Some key things, if we see them when we're out there, that we should definitely pay attention to is if we see recent avalanche activity, especially on similar slopes that we were thinking about skiing that day. So similar aspects and elevation that was in our plan for the day, that should make us reassess our plan for sure, because that's the mountain screaming in our face. If we're getting any cracking or collapsing, What that is that you've basically triggered an avalanche. There's just not enough, maybe the slope's probably not steep enough for it to go anywhere. But again, that's like the mountain screaming at us that the snow is unstable and we want to be conservative with our route finding and decision making that day. Winds, any sort of recent wind drifted snow, or, you know, if we're looking up high and we see snow blowing around on ridge tops, that's something we want to definitely be aware of and paying attention to. Any sort of rain or new snow, especially as we get into the spring. Hopefully we're not seeing it too much, but rain or that wet new snow. The snowpack does not like rapid change, which is kind of the trend with all of these 5 red flags, as we call them. But anytime we're adding rain or a lot of new moisture to the snowpack, we definitely, again, want to go back to our terrain choices and thinking about being a bit more conservative. And then this is a big one as we get into the spring, is definitely evidence of rapid thawing. So if you start to see those roller balls, that just means that the snowpack's heating up. And just, again, being aware of our timing during the day, that comes into play a lot more in spring skiing, of making sure that we're not hitting it when it's still too firm, but also hitting it right in that sweet spot where the core and snow is good. And so just paying attention to those clues around you and how the snow is changing on the aspects that you're thinking of seeing that day. And then also when we're out there, making sure we're getting out of harm's way. So thinking about where our group is stopping and regrouping, how we're going to ski the slope. A lot of times we ski one at a time, but also thinking about how we're going to travel across the slope on the way up is just as important on the way down. And having clear communication with your group so that everyone makes sure that they know the plan. It's really hard, right? If you're watching someone ski down a slope and you're like, that's really not what we talked about, and I don't feel that good about that person skiing there now. So just making sure that you have good communication with your group, a good travel plan, both on the up and the down. And again, just like I was saying, is, you know, just some reminders on the human factors out there, is having a good plan, reassessing that plan with your partners, keeping eyes on your partners, and really trying to do your best to stay out from underneath avalanche paths, especially when you're stopping or when you're looking at the snowpack. And just recognizing that everyone processes snow safety and hazards a little bit differently. We're pretty lucky with this demographic of, you know, especially ski racers or competitive snow sport athletes, is that if that's the group that you're going out in the backcountry with, they're great skiers and riders, which is definitely important to have in a group. But we also want to be aware of what we don't know. What skills do we lack? You know, when I first got into backcountry skiing, I had grown up ski racing, but I didn't know a lot about the backcountry. So I was still sticking to more conservative terrain because my backcountry knowledge and my avalanche knowledge didn't match my skiing ability. So that's just something we want to be thinking about and talking about with our group as well. I think it gets assumed a lot of times that just because people are great skiers, they know everything about the mountains, and having some self-awareness about what you don't know and what the strengths and weaknesses are of your group. But like I said earlier, it's still important to listen to everyone's observations, because maybe someone doesn't know what it means, but if they see something that makes them a little bit nervous, it is worth bringing up to the group. And then, like we all know too, just being aware of some of the social pressures in the backcountry. Sometimes we're drawn towards places of untracked snow, or we see someone hitting that cliff, and so we feel pressure to do so. And so just having a really good group that you can have open dialogue with, and you can say, hey, I'm not really into hitting that cliff today. I'll spot you if you're feeling it, and if our group feels good about you doing that, but I'm going to ski around it. That's totally an acceptable thing to do in the backcountry for sure. So just thinking about as you're going out this spring, having a good team and really selecting terrain that matches what the forecast is, both the avalanche forecast and the weather forecast, and thinking, you know, is this the right day to ski this objective that I've wanted to do? Or does the forecast not really match the objective that I want to ski today and I need to think about something else? And again, just going back to keeping it simple, going back to the basics and enjoying every day that we're out there, because the number one goal is that we want to come home safely.
We want you to realize that avalanches are dangerous, but you can avoid getting caught in them. First, get the gear, but then you've got to get the training before ever going into the backcountry. Next, always check your local avalanche forecast so you can anticipate the given avalanche conditions for the day. You can get the picture by looking for the obvious signs of instability, and you'll be getting out of harm's way by managing your exposure to potentially hazardous slopes.
A lot of times when people watch us in the films, all they see is the action of us shredding these big lines. But what you don't see is the behind the scene, all the prep that goes into making sure that the slopes are safe, checking out the snowpack, waiting for snow to settle, doing all the homework it takes to safely rip the big lines.
All this information is great and incredibly practical. But at the end of the day, if you feel uneasy about something, it's about having the courage to say no and walk away. The mountain isn't going anywhere.
It doesn't matter if you've made thousands of good calls. All it takes is one bad call, and that's one too many. Some days the mountains are screaming, get out of here, and some days the mountains are going, come on in, it's time to party.
So thank you, everyone. We're going to get into the Q&A section now. Tom's gonna come back online and help me with that part. So we make sure we're getting to all your questions. And then just as a reminder, when we're done with the Q&A around 6 o'clock, we will show the full length video of Off-Piste. And again, just thank you everyone for tuning in tonight, and we're gonna get to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay, for all of this great information, and to everyone who joined us here tonight. Kind of a simple one to start with. Julie had asked about if you could provide a little more information on InReach and other comparable devices, a little bit of a different approach with these locators. Can you tell us a little bit about their value in the backcountry and how you go about learning more about how to use them?
Yeah, so I now ski with, I always have a InReach Mini. So it's about this big, and really it's just a satellite device. And the nice thing about it, so if I'm in an area without cell phone service, is you can two-way text on it as well. So I can say to someone, you know, yes, you expected me home at this time. I'm going to be a little late. Everything's okay. I can also pre-schedule messages. And then there's an SOS button too that would be like, everything is gone wrong and I need way more help out here. And to put it kind of in the context of avalanche rescue is, like they said in some of the videos, is your group is, they are the first responders if there were to be an avalanche accident. And that 15-minute mark is pretty critical. That doesn't mean we would stop, you would stop digging or looking for them after that. But then once someone is buried in an avalanche, they're going to be cold. They probably have some sort of injuries, and you might need help then getting them out. And so that's where an inReach can be really nice too, is you've just hit the SOS button. You can focus on the rescue in the short term, but you know that you have sent that out, and so that there's resources coming your way. And you can just buy them online, and then you get a subscription. So I think I pay like $10 a month for a yearly subscription, and it gives me a certain amount of texts, and I use it mountain biking. I use it when I go on river trips. So it's a really nice just satellite communication device to have when you're off the grid.
Lindsay, did it take much to learn how to use it? Does Garmin, for example, have videos to help you understand how the system works and what you need to do?
Yeah, it comes with really good instructions on how to set it up. And then before I go out in the backcountry, at the beginning of each season, I'll just test it with my friends when I'm inbounds and make sure that my messages are going out and everything's working okay. But it is very user friendly, and the instructions are really easy to follow, and Garmin has some good support for it.
Cool. Thanks very much. Let's go back to another topic that we talked about earlier. It's going to be in the video, but it really is core to what we try to talk about with Brass, and that is, can you talk a little bit more about the difference between off-piste and in-piste when skiers and athletes are in Europe? I know it's different than in America, but let's dive into that a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, so in the US, Ski Patrol controls everything that's inbounds, and they open terrain according to what's been controlled. In Europe, it is different. So in Europe, as a blanket statement, when they refer to something as on-piste, it's typically a groomed run, and you know that's controlled. Anything that's ungroomed is off-piste, and it's not necessarily controlled by Ski Patrol. And that's where, again, going back to, something I said earlier, and they'll get more into this in the video, but it can be challenging to figure out what is or isn't controlled in Europe. And that's where talking to Ski Patrol is an excellent resource. But your best bet, if you're concerned about it, is when you're in Europe, either hiring a guide. They're a great resource as well to kind of figure out the scene. And that's not just true for Europe. That's true for any place that you're going new that you haven't been to before. And talking to Ski Patrol so that you clearly understand what is controlled and what isn't controlled. But as a blanket statement, in Europe, off-piste is not controlled, on-piste is controlled, which is the groomed runs.
I just want to highlight, Lindsay, what you mentioned briefly here about having a guide. I think culturally, those of us in America, when we ski here, we don't think about it as much, but when we go to Europe, we do. But it really is a valuable service, whether you're here in America, in Canada, or overseas.
Yeah, and I know that that's one obviously benefit that I have of being a guide, but if I go to a new snowpack, or I've done some trips up in Canada and different countries over the years, is the first thing I'm doing is reaching out to local guides to get information. And a lot of times the first day that I'm skiing there, I'm skiing with a guide that's local to the area as well. So it can be a great resource to just learn about what's been going on with the snowpack this winter, get some ideas of good places to ski or ride the rest of your trip there.
Lindsay, we have a question in the Q&A from Derek about slope pitch, and you had a great image earlier in the presentation that had all of the different slope degrees of pitch indicated on it. But when we're out there in the backcountry, how do we really tell? Because it is a pretty vital component to our safety.
So there's a lot of different tools. So before I go out in the backcountry, there's some apps and mapping programs like CalTopo and Gaia, Gaia, and they have, I think if you buy the pro version, which they're not that expensive, you can get slope shading overlays. So it actually is an overlay that you can put on a topo map when you're in your planning process to see, okay, it's red, that means it's avalanche terrain, it's that 38 to 45 degrees, or 35 to 45 degrees. Orange is just below 35 degrees, low 30s. And then there's various colors, and it has a key to it all of what slope angle it is. So that's what I'll do when I'm in my planning phase, is I'll use those overlays so I have a general idea of how steep slopes are. And then when you're out in the field, there's different tools as well, is I'll still use those mapping tools to just see where I am relative to the different steepness and terrain. And then there's also inclinometers that you can use, or apps that you can measure, that you can get on your phone to measure slope angles. So I'll just put a ski pole down and then I'll put my phone on top of it so I can measure the angle of the slope. And that will give me that information. And then some of it, just like everything, is just practicing and training your eye to like, oh, I think that looks about that degree. Now I'm going to check it. And okay, cool. I was like pretty on with that. But a lot of it for me comes in my planning stage, and then I'm just confirming it in the field. And one downside to those slope shading overlays is that they'll miss like small rollovers or anything like that. So if you are out in the field and you're using those, you still want to be looking around to say like, oh yeah, there's a little rollover that's a little bit steeper, that it was just too small of a feature for those overlays to catch.
Lindsay, earlier you talked a little bit and showed in a video avalanche safety airbags. Avalanche is another safety device. They're different. Can you talk about the differences between them? Are they complementary? Can they be used together?
Yeah, so at this point, Avalanche is a little bit older technology. So when it came out, the idea is that when you ski down, you put a hose or a tube in your mouth that you would have when you skied. And then if you were to get caught, then when you exhaled, the CO2 would go out like the back pocket of your backpack. And so it would give you more time to breathe in if you were to be buried. That's like that asphyxiation that they talked about that people die from when they're buried in avalanches. The idea of airbags, which I would say that's now like more current technology. If you were to purchase something, I would recommend an airbag. Is that it's like the Brazil nut philosophy, or if you like have a bag of potato chips and you were to shake it up, you open the bag, the biggest chip is going to be on top. So it just increases your surface area if you were to get caught, and that you're gonna hopefully stay on top of the avalanche. Definitely a couple of things to consider with airbag packs is if you ski a lot in places where there's trees or rocks, if you were to have to pull that airbag, it could get punctured by, trees or rocks or stuff like that. So airbags tend to work like a lot better in just like big open run out zones and open avalanche paths. That doesn't mean that you can't still use them in trees, or they might not still, they might still be effective in that slopes, but that's just something to consider. And then just like anything is, everyone that I've talked to who's actually had to pull their airbag, is the thing I've heard a lot is that it's taken them like 1 or 2 tries to actually get their airbag to pull. So again, just practicing knowing where that trigger is. And then again, like checking it once a year to make sure that your airbag's actually going to deploy when you need it. Most airbag packs now are battery or fan operated. So you can pull them multiple times and you can just recharge it first. There are still some canister systems out there. So if you pull the airbag, then you need to get the canister refilled. But that's still recommended to make sure that it's going to work when you need it.
Well, we have just a minute. If there's any other questions, please put them into the chat. And while I have just a minute, and before we have you introduce the film, Lindsay, I wanted to just thank everyone on behalf of Brass for coming online tonight and spending 60 to 90 minutes of your time to hopefully make your experience safer in the backcountry, and those all around you safer as well. This year, Brass has conducted probably around a dozen of these online workshops, either educational sessions like this or webinars bringing in various experts to provide safety information to the community. All of this is being done free. And if you feel this has been a good service to you, please go to brassavalanche.org and punch the donate button and send a few bucks towards Brass so we can continue to put these educational programs out for free for skiers and snowboarders from around the country and around the world. I don't see any more questions, Lindsay, so we'll turn it back to you to introduce the film.
Great, thanks, Tom, and thank you to everyone for joining tonight. We're going to show the 13-minute version, the full-length version of the off-piste video. A big thank you to Utah Avalanche Center, to the Burlaks, to the Assels, to everyone that went into creating this video. It's a very powerful video. It's definitely worth watching if you haven't seen it before. They do a reenactment of the accident that happened that day on January 5th, as Cindy talked about earlier. And yeah, I just can't say enough good things about how great this video is and how powerful it can be. Enjoy, and thank you, everyone.
You guys see him up there? Guys, what should we do? Start breathing!
Are they wearing beacons?
No beacons.
Dispatch, possible 2 avalanche victims buried. I see something. Is this one of your friends?
Yeah, that's Bryce.
No pulse. Starting CPR. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 2, 23, 24, 5, 6, 7, 8. Lift on 3. 1, 2, 3. Are you sure there were only 2?
Yeah, there's two.
Okay, we're gonna find him.
Sorry!
Not breathing, no pulse. Starting CPR.
Can turn deadly in a matter of seconds.
It's hard to believe that such a tragedy could happen.
The accident has left many in the skiing world in shock.
Tragic news tonight as 2 elite skiers training for a spot on the U.S. Olympic team are killed in an avalanche.
Rescue crews from Solden were on the scene immediately with multiple helicopters.
Our thoughts and prayers are with those who are apparently lost in this specific incident.
Go for it, Brycey!
Who are you? I'm Bryce Astle. How does the gangster chains play into effect in your slalom skiing? Pretty aerodynamic.
Happy birthday to you.
I was shattered, and I know everyone around me was too, and can't even possibly imagine what it was like for the families.
Losing Bryce and Ronnie was a huge hit to the U.S. team. They're the next generation. These 2 guys were the best in their disciplines. Bryce in slalom, Ronnie in downhill and Super G. They were the next up-and-comers. They could be the guys competing in the Olympics.
This is the famous smile because he had just won U.S. Nationals Juniors.
He always had my back, and it makes you appreciate it more now that he's not here, you know?
Bryce was such an important part of my life, and after we lost him, it was a pretty easy decision for my wife and I to name our son Bryce.
He lived for every moment. He would get done training and he would go out and he would ski.
And this is a card that we made up at the time we lost the boys, and it has Bryce, so amazing on skis, and Ronnie in his element going 70 miles an hour through the air. He was kind, and he was grounded.
Ronnie, he was always just a jokester. He wasn't afraid of the World Cup vet. He would just always speak his mind to me, and I love that about him, you know?
Watching him laughing just made me think, wow, I have the best brother ever.
He was a good teammate, he was a good friend, a good son, and we had a lot of fun together.
January 1st, 2015, I took Bryce to the airport. He was going to hook up with Ronnie Burlack and the rest of the U.S. ski team. They were going to Europe to train for Europa Cup.
We got to Solden, and it had just snowed a lot.
Obviously, there's no training because there's so much snow. So we sent everyone out to go ski around and have some fun.
Just seeing snow that's untouched and being like, this is a dream come true.
We were having an amazing time.
We could see the bottom of the valley, we could see the road, so we started skiing.
I just remember skiing across this face, and all of a sudden, I just heard cracking.
Everything underneath me started moving.
I saw Bryce, and I heard him say, oh shit. I never even saw Ronnie. We stood there, and we watched them go. Nothing made any sense. Then it just instinct took over, and there were people who had skied down right before us who saw everything and pulled out their transceivers.
Are they wearing beacons?
No beacons. No avalanche equipment.
I need shovels, I need shovels.
That was when I realized how stupid we were being.
Okay, does anybody have a probe? We're at the bottom of Solden 1. We need helicopter, 2 more patrollers, hasty team, then AED.
Probably took 15 minutes for helicopters to come in.
I was like pretty aware that it had been too long. The first thing that appeared was Bryce's boots sticking up out of the snow. He was upside down. His boot was 6 feet from the surface. Came across Ronnie a few minutes later.
Ronnie, we got him. Can you get him out of the hole?
That was an image that I'll never forget.
The concept of riding up a lift, skiing on a trail, and we're in danger, that did not exist in any of our heads.
The coaches and the boys did not receive any orientation or any training regarding the dangers of skiing in Europe versus skiing in North America.
None of the young men in that group knew the difference between on and off-piste. Off-piste in the United States is defined as out of bounds, going through the gate, going under the rope. That's not what the rules are in Europe. When you are off the groomer, you are off-piste.
In Solden, the day before the avalanche that killed Bryce and Ronnie, there had been heavy snowfall and strong winds. What that did is it put a lot of weight on top of the snowpack, which was fragile. Once these skiers got onto that slope, it couldn't support the additional weight. That weak layer fractured over a wide area, and that slab came crashing down. It produced debris that weighed almost 7 million pounds, the same as almost 10 747s.
It takes all of 20 minutes to learn and to be educated.
You want to make sure you're prepared. There are 5 points that are always really good to remember. You want to get the gear, get the training, get the forecast, get the picture, and get out of harm's way.
First, you need the gear. Going in the backcountry, you need a beacon, a probe, and a shovel. And unfortunately, that day in Solon, the boys did not have that.
I would have done anything for rescue gear, especially a shovel.
You can always increase your chances of being surgible if you're unlucky enough to be caught in an avalanche by having rectal reflectors in your equipment and clothing.
Getting the gear is useless if you don't know how to use it. You've got to get the training. Take an avalanche class.
If we would have taken just one class, we would have known not to ski down that terrain in the first place.
One key thing you're going to learn in every avalanche class is that you have to check the forecast every time you ride.
None of us checked the forecast that morning. It would have taken just 2 minutes on the gondola ride, and none of this would have happened.
So when you're out on the snow, you gotta get the picture. And what does that mean? That means pay attention. Are you seeing recent avalanches? That's by far the most important clue. That's like Mother Nature screaming in your ear.
If we had known it wasn't controlled, we 100% would not have been there.
Finally, get out of harm's way. What that means is only one person is riding the slope at a time.
We were breaking one of the simplest rules. In some ways, it's a miracle that all 6 of us didn't die.
Once you get to the bottom, you need to get out of the way. That way, if somebody else in your group triggers an avalanche, you won't be caught.
These 5 simple steps everyone should know about, and everybody should be trained in. Coaches, parents, athletes, administrators of the program.
Everything that we did could have easily been prevented. I wish I could say that I couldn't have done anything to save their lives. That's just not true.
Anytime you have a major accident like this, it causes a ton of introspective thought. We realized that we really needed to look at it from the top down, bottom up. How can we make sure everybody's more educated to avert and reduce the chance of anything like this ever happening again?
That's why we at Brass are creating avalanche education specifically for coaches and athletes. We're also creating snow safety policies to be followed by ski racing groups.
Ski racing is definitely a dangerous sport. But what we're going down is a really highly regulated area. You have all the fencing, you have the snow prep, you have all these things that are out there to keep you safe. When you get out there in the backcountry, there's none of those luxuries.
For the people who assume that just because they know how to ski terrain or they know how to rip down a mountain because they ski downhill, it's a very different beast.
Don't let this happen to you and your family. Get educated, get out there, so we can keep skiing for Bryce and Ronnie, so their legacies live on.
Thank you all for joining us tonight for Brass 101, a very poignant film, but a lot of lessons and learnings to come out of it. Again, go to brassavalanche.org to get more links and information. We'll send you links from the chat via email in the next day or so, along with a recording that you can share with your friends. And if you
appreciate what you've seen tonight and been a part of, please drop a donation to brassavalanche.org. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night and be safe out there. Have an awesome spring.